Good morning.
Good morning.
Topic, learning how to think professionally. It was given to me. When I saw it, it seemed easy enough. So I read the words, and they just sound like a bunch of words strung together that don't mean anything. So I don't know what this means, and I was talking to Philip earlier, and he said that's good. You get to make it mean whatever you want it to, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to talk about Leviticus. So I'll try to play along a little bit and tie it into this topic. Professional, I think of two things. You get paid, right? I think that's the meaning, right? You get paid to do something. And the other one is that you're appropriate. Okay, being professional. You look or act appropriate. So we'll try to pull those things in when we talk about this. When we talk about ministry, we don't just think in terms of professionalism. We're not just doing a religious job. We're doing something more, and we talk a lot of times in terms of vocation. When we think of vocation, we think of this particular suitability for what we're doing, or this job that requires some type of worthiness or respect that goes along with it. So we'll pull some of those thoughts in as well. When we think about, especially vocation, I have been reading this book by Eugene Peterson called Under the Unpredictable Plant, which is a reference to Jonah, of course. And the book is a kind of a little study on Jonah's life, but what I found particularly interesting for today is his subtitle here, which is an exploration in vocational holiness. So I thought we could spend a little time investigating that nomenclature of vocational holiness. And he does this through the book of Jonah. I'm going to do it through the book of Leviticus, but before I get there, I do want to read a couple of things that he has to say to kind of get you thinking in terms of what he's talking about. Let's see. All right, pastoral work is local. Nineveh. The difficulty in carrying it out is that we have a universal gospel, but distressingly limited by time and space. We are under command to go into all the world to proclaim the gospel to every creature. We work under the large rubrics of heaven and hell. And now we find ourselves in a town of 3,000 people on the far edge of Kansas, in which the library is under-budgeted, the radio station plays only country music, the high school football team provides all the celebrities the town can manage, and a covered dish supper is the high point of congregational life. It's hard for a person who's been schooled in the urgencies of apocalyptic, with an imagination furnished with saints and angels, to live in this town very long and take part in its conversations, without getting a little impatient, growing pretty bored, and wondering if it wasn't an impulsive mistake to abandon that ship going to Tarshish. And one more here. I remind you that Jonah in Nineveh is not an ideal pastor. Jonah is not an ideal anything, but he is a pastor. That Jonah's story is gracious and that it does not give us a pastoral model that is oppressive by its weight and demands. Jonah in Nineveh is surly. They're out of obedience and obedience alone. A reluctant, bad-tempered obedience, but still obedience. He is there, not in Tarshish, not someplace else. And the place has a name, Nineveh. Every church is located someplace. There are no churches in general, no generic churches, no one-size-fits-all churches. And the pastor is the person set down in the named location. I want to use this name Nineveh and Jonah's work there to reflect on how the sense of place is so essential to the pastoral vocation, immerses us in particulars, and shapes our ministry. So he's going to emphasize throughout this book this idea of small town, small stuff, small items that get in the way of those big things that we like to think of as vocational holiness. So he's going to redefine a lot of things as we go through this. I'll read one more and then we'll leave him for a while. Let's see. In my hurry to recover the essentials of spirituality and life, a sense of the presence of God, a spacious leisure for savoring grace, I had thrown away the raw material for it, my list. He's talking about like to-do lists and all these little things you have to do in church work all the time. I do them and throw them out. The items that I thought were interfering with the holiness of my vocation were the very materials of its holiness. Leading a congregation in worship was glorious. The weekly gathering of hungry and thirsty people around bounteous mysteries of word and sacrament. But telephoning a couple of forgetful sinners later to straighten out a misunderstanding on the nursery schedule was a triviality I resented. Teaching university students was a high calling, but getting the grades to the registrar's office was an irritation. Praying for God's healing and love was a priestly honor, but listening to the whine and resentment of an unattractive man was something I was going to delegate to my deacons next time around. This is what Peterson calls his Jonah work. Okay, his work in Nineveh, giving loving and leisurely advice and attention to everyday details of Nineveh life, and at the same time living in this urgency, this eschatological that he's been trained to think in terms of. As is the case most often with Peterson, if you've ever read his work, he's going to flip kind of cultural understandings of things and ask you to rethink them. And he always does this as well with well-meaning Christian definitions, well-meaning Christian cultural expectations. In this case of what it means to be a minister, sometimes we have this tendency to get sidetracked from helping the people of God be the people of God because of the expectations around us. All right, so this is where we'll talk about Leviticus. I'll come back to Peterson at the end briefly. When we talk about cultural expectations and professional expectations, we think a lot in terms of dress and speech and tradition. And these things are different depending on where you are. He mentions that there is no one Nineveh. They all look different. And so if you want to be regarded as professional, you need to go to your context wherever it is and open your eyes and put the right clothes on and talk in the correct manner and play along. And all of those things change from place to place. They look different. You can't teach them one way. But we're not just talking about professionalism. We're thinking about ministry as a profession. And then we do that. We want to be taken seriously, so we act professional. But we know there's a lot more to it than looking the part. We have our vocation. We have these lofty ideals that we've thought about and worked through in our own mind. And how do we integrate those lofty ideals with the pettiness of everyday life? So, let's look at Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 10. Leviticus chapter 10, verse 10. Speaking to Aaron, the priesthood. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. You are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them through Moses. Very succinct definition of priesthood, and an interesting way to think about our own ministry, I think. We're going to use the book of Leviticus as kind of an analogy for modern ministry. And so when we look at this short definition of priesthood, we find the priest, in this case, not focusing so much on sacrifice, but focusing on one who is a teacher. And a teacher who knows the difference between things. Okay, knows the difference between, what are the categories we have here? Holy and common, unclean and clean. Someone who can distinguish the difference and then convey that difference to people. Because in ancient Israel, these are things that have the potential to create life as well as create death. And what I want to do, probably a really bad idea, but I want to talk about what those four things mean. Okay? Holy, common, clean, and unclean. I don't have any charts, which is really what you need for this, but I'm going to try to explain what this means and then think about a way it can play out as we practice these ideals. All right, we've got two sets here. Holy and common is one set, clean and unclean is another set. If you live in ancient Israel, you are one of these four things all the time. And everything that you see and touch is one of these four things all the time. Maybe two of them. Okay? And part of the difficulty as we think about them and try to describe them is how are they defined? They're defined by not being the other one. Okay? What is clean? It's not unclean. And unclean is the opposite of clean. So they're opposites. These two pairs are opposites that kind of define each other. As we kind of make our way through this, and I'll just describe it, then we're going to read something. But there are normal states, and there are abnormal states. The normal states are common and clean. Okay, if you're common, it's normal. If you're clean, that's normal. And then there's two abnormalities that are on the edges. Okay, the abnormalities are holiness and uncleanness. Okay, one is a good abnormal, one is a bad abnormal. All right. Now, you can be two of them. A clean thing can be holy, or it can be common. Okay, that makes sense. A common thing can be clean, or it can be unclean. Okay, but there's one thing that can't happen, which is what? It can't be holy and unclean. These don't work. Okay, so these are antagonists, holy and unclean. And when these things become one, that's when bad stuff happens in Israel, right? Holy and unclean don't go together. All right. One other aspect about this, and I promise I'm going to do something with it in a minute, about holy and unclean is that they're dynamic, or a better word is that they're contagious. Okay? Holiness is contagious. It can move. It can change things. Uncleanness is contagious from the other end of the spectrum. It can change things. They can change the state of something into something else. The other two, pure and common, they're not contagious. They just are. They're normal. Okay? They're static. Since these things are not fixed in ancient Israel, Israel can move. Israel can change, and they can move between these states. All right. In addition to this, the concept of holiness, which is what we're supposed to be talking about here. Holiness is God. God is holy. Okay. Are people holy? Yep, people are holy. But they're not holy like God's holy. Right? Okay. So one other thing in Israel is you've got God, you've got high priests, Levites, people, nations, just kind of goes down the line. God is holy, and these other things can be holy, but they can't be holy like God is holy. These are called grades of holiness. Okay, they're the same thing, but they're different. Okay, and so that's another concept that's going to come in as we talk about this. All right, so holiness. This is where we're going. Holiness in ancient Israel. Everybody knows the definition of holiness, right? It's distinctive, set apart, different. Okay, that is a wonderful, perfect definition, and it means very, very little to us. Okay, it just doesn't hold a lot of meaning. It's very correct. Holiness is ultimately what God is, and one of the reasons it's so difficult to define holiness, and think about how it might play into our own vocation as ministers. One of the reasons it's so difficult to define is because it's not a metaphor, and most of the descriptions of God are metaphors. God is a king. God is a judge. God is a father. Why are these easy to understand? They're metaphors from daily life. We know what these things are. We've seen them. Holiness is not one. How do you define holiness? It's what God is. Okay? So you can see the inherent difficulty in trying to understand what it is, and yet it's so important for understanding who we are and what we're to be. Okay? All right. So one of the ways that we can go about considering what this might be is to look at a place where it's used heavily. And I've chosen Leviticus 19 as the example. So what I want us to do is I'm going to read a chapter of the Bible that we don't read very often. It's not the kind of uplifting thing we like to read as a little devotional. But I want you to just kind of pay attention to the categories that are being described, to what holiness is, and to kind of just experience this text for a few minutes. And then we'll back up and have a few things to say about it. All right, so Leviticus 19. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You shall each revere your mother and father. You shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make cast images for yourself. I am the Lord your God. When you offer a sacrifice of well-being to the Lord, offer it in such a way that it is acceptable on your behalf. It shall be eaten on the same day you offer it, or on the next day, and anything left over until the third day shall be consumed in fire. If it is eaten all on the third day, it's an abomination. It will not be acceptable. All who eat it shall be subject to punishment, because they have profaned what is holy to the Lord. And any such person shall be cut off from the people. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, and you shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal. You shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. You shall not revile the deaf, or put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate in your heart anyone of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your animals breed with different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed. You shall not put on a garment made of two different materials. If a man has sexual relations with a woman who is a slave designated for another man, but not ransomed or given for her freedom, an inquiry shall be held. They shall not be put to death, since she has not been freed, but he shall bring a guilt offering for himself to the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, a ram as a guilt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of guilt, offering before the Lord for his sin that he committed, and the sin he committed shall be forgiven. When you come into the land and plant all kinds of trees and food, you shall regard their fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden to you. It must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all their fruit shall be set apart for rejoicing in the Lord. But in the 5th year you may eat their fruit, and their yield may be increased for you. I am the Lord your God. You shall not eat anything with blood. You shall not practice augury or witchcraft. You shall not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard. You shall not make any gashes in your flesh for the dead or tattoo any marks upon you. I am the Lord. Do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, that the land may become prostituted and full of depravity. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not turn to mediums or wizards. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. You shall rise above the age and defer to the old. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. You shall not cheat in measuring length, weight, or quantity. You shall have honest balances, honest weights, an honest ephah, and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall keep all my statutes and all my ordinances and observe them. I am the Lord. Okay, I know it's weird. right? A lot of stuff that's just different context and very far off. But if you were able to kind of stick with it and stay awake, you heard a lot of things that are very familiar as well, okay? And those items are there too. And so when we talk about holiness in ancient Israel, it's important, first of all, that a lot of our misunderstandings, they're simple and they're easy to overcome. Holiness is not just God, okay? It's especially God, but it's not just God. It's also priest, extends, moves beyond God. It's not even religious or moral, okay? These elements are involved. You heard religious and moral elements in there, but that's not what holiness is. Holiness is not being pure, right? Holiness is not purity. Purity is what? Purity. Purity is cleanness, all right? So holiness is not cleanness. Holiness is something else. It's reflecting this aspect of God that is only revealed in and only comes from God. Again, you can see the difficulty in our definition here. All right, a couple of things I'm going to go through really quickly. Holiness is a fact of existence in Israel. God is holy, Israel is holy. Israel is holy because God is holy. All right? There are grades of this. They are not holy in the same way as God, but it's a fact that they are holy. Also, holiness is a task. It has certain implications. Kind of the idea of you're holy, so be holy. Be what you are, which involves a lot of different aspects of life. It especially involves in this chapter not being unclean, because if you're unclean, this threatens your status as a holy people. Okay? And so these categories, like we talked about before, are not fixed. Israel can move between them and change. When this change happens, in Israel, the world changes. Okay? If holy is being contagious and advancing, what's happening to the world? It's becoming holy, which means what's happening to impurity. There's less of it. Now, it's never going to go away because impurity is not sin. It's always going to be there. It's just facts of life in certain cases, but there's supposed to be less of it. More holiness and less impurity. Or, if impurity is moving, what's happening? It's getting stuffy in the temple, right? God's getting stepped on. So these things are contagious in Israel. And the next chapter of Leviticus then says, this is all about being distinct. This is all about being distinct as God is distinct, being distinct from the nations. And finally, holiness is all of life. And this is probably what you saw in this. Holiness is about this other God, this God who is different, this God who is not like other things. And you probably noticed in there that these commands that are given, they're not just a bunch of do not do this, do not do this. There is that, but there's also a lot of do it this way. Okay, so holiness is not just about keeping the do nots. It's about going beyond that. Okay, it's about respecting family, being loyal to God, being generous, having compassion for the disabled, caring for justice, sexual integrity, not having ill treatment toward minorities, and being honest in any kind of transaction you go through. And you heard the refrain, I am the Lord, I am the Lord. What's it saying? Your quality of life reflects my character. You do this because I am the Lord. Your quality of life reflects my character. I require this of you because it reflects what I am. This is what I would do. So this is what you would do. All this identifies Israel with like a task, with a mission. Okay, it's that Israel's identity is very, very closely tied to being distinctive from everything else in the way that God is distinctive from everything else. Okay, and this then leads to influence, it leads to change, and it leads to a challenge for ministers who are responsible for teaching what it means to be holy. Even when those categories can be very confusing to a lot of people. It's about justice, honesty, fairness, mercy, love. It's about speaking what God is. Okay? The name of God. Who God is. Peterson I got 2 minutes. He, near the end of his book, he highlights one of the problems with ministers is that we view ourselves as messiahs and managers. We want these lofty roles. The Messiah who fixes all the problems, who says the right thing at the right time. The manager who finds the deacon to do the work. And he says that these are good things, these are wonderful things, but these are not vocational holiness. Vocational holiness is something else. Now here's the tough part. I cannot be a pastor in this American culture, maybe any culture, if I'm not skilled in slipping quite effortlessly in and out of the messianic and the managerial. Doing good messianic work, doing good managerial work, I'm good at this work. People expect this work. It is gospel work. I cannot be a pastor and not do this work. But both of these high-profile modes, singly and together, crowd against the shy and most quiet work of spiritual direction and push it out of the way. Spiritual direction is practiced by pastors in the very context that constantly interferes with the practice. That is why it's so frequently not practiced. The setting is not congenial. But no excuses. Being a spiritual director is far more essential and important than being messianic and managerial. Even though we cannot function outside of these contexts. Spiritual direction is the act of paying attention to God, calling attention to God, being attentive to God. Holiness. This is all holiness. In a person, circumstance, or situation. I sometimes identify spiritual direction as what I'm doing when I don't think I'm doing anything important. Not doing what I'm paid to do, not doing what people expect me to do, not making anything happen. All the people around me, God loving them, Christ saving them, the Holy Spirit wooing them, they don't notice. They believe in God, follow Christ, receive the Holy Spirit, they've been baptized, they worship with God's people, but they're not much aware of God or Christ or Spirit. Mostly they're aware of getting ahead, obeying orders, checking off laundry list items. This is not enough. The pastor is set in community to insist that it is not enough to bring to recognition what is blurred and forgotten. To discern the Spirit. To name God when the name of God slips their minds. I'm terrible with names, they say. All right, fine, says the pastor who's a spiritual director. I understand. This is Yahweh. Here's Christos. The idea is that if you want to offer holiness, you offer God, you have to know God, and you have to know how to speak of God accurately. We could go on with Leviticus. James does. James likes Leviticus 19, if you've ever read James closely. But what it all comes back to is the very beginning of Leviticus 19, verse 2. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy. There's this continuity between God and people, what men and women are becoming. But this is applied to our vocation as well, because we're not just to teach holiness, like Leviticus 10. We are to do that. But as professionals, as those interested in vocational holiness, we don't just teach, but we demonstrate holiness, which means we get involved in the little things. The little fights that annoy us, we help, the little lists that people forget about, again, we help. We model holiness so that what? When they meet someone else, maybe they can model holiness as well. That brings us back to those grades of holiness. And passing, extending, it's contagious. And it brings us back to that sense of task and mission that are so closely aligned in Leviticus 19. Okay.